This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am joined tonight by Dr. Jack Hunter. How you doing, Jack?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. And I just finished reading your new book.
Oh, wonderful.
And this is not out yet, right? Manifesting Spirits is the name of it.
Yeah, it should be out any day now.
Okay, all right. And it will be available everywhere?
Yep.
And how long? I mean, this looks like it's been like a 10-year project for you.
It has, I suppose. I mean, this book is the book that has ultimately stemmed out of my PhD thesis. So it's kind of like the culmination of all of that research that I was doing into mediumship and the Bristol Spirit Lodge and different kinds of anthropological approaches to the paranormal. So I think it's kind of like the culmination of all of that, the crystallization of it all, so that I can kind of move on to different things now.
And you are a doctor of what?
Of anthropology, yeah. Okay. So the book is based around the fieldwork that I did for my thesis with the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And the Bristol Spirit Lodge is a small private home circle for developing trance and physical mediumship. I don't know if you know much about physical mediumship, but it's the sort of branch of spiritualist mediumship that is involved with producing things like ectoplasm, materializations, things like that, physical phenomena. Yeah. So it was quite an interesting group that I happened to stumble across. They're only about 20 minutes up the road from where I was living at the time, which was quite handy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I went up to meet the circle leader and have a chat and explain to her, my interest in these things, and to ask if I could, attend seances with them to write my thesis about them. And thankfully, she was very kind and we got on well. So she invited me up to the lodge, and I started to attend then quite regularly for at least 2 or 3 years. I was going quite regularly, and then I sort of slowly started to stop going. But overall, my research on the group was about 7 years worth of research.
Wow.
Obviously, that's not 7 years of just going to seances non-stop, but there was a period of intense seance attendance, and then a much longer period after that of trying to make sense of the experiences and putting it all into its sort of academic context.
I didn't even really know seances were still a big thing anywhere, especially the physical ones.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, physical mediumship is kind of like a bit of a fringe practice, even within mediumship, which itself is a fringe practice. So the majority of places that you might find, if you're looking for sort of like a spiritualist church or a spiritualist center to go to, I mean, there are lots of those in Bristol, which is quite interesting in itself. But in a spiritualist church or a spiritualist center, the medium will usually do some form of, they call it mental mediumship, where they, pick up messages, usually symbolic messages to do with a dead loved one. And they'll say something like, I'm getting a J coming through. Can anyone accept that? And then someone in the audience will put their hand up, and then the medium will do a reading for them like that. But the mediums that I worked with in this private group were developing trance mediumship, where they would go into a deep altered state of consciousness. They would each have their own sort of methods of getting into that kind of trance state. And they would have different kinds of experiences of falling into those trance states as well. But when they were in the trance, a spirit or different spirits would communicate through their bodies. And each medium had a group of, up to like 15 different spirits who would come through their bodies And they would call these a spirit team. So each medium had their own group of spirits who would regularly come through. So in that sense, it was quite different to the kind of mediumship that you find in the spiritualist churches, because, in the spiritualist church, you would go, specifically maybe because you want to contact a loved one or you've had a bereavement or something like that, and you would hope to get contact from your deceased loved one. Whereas in the physical and trance circles, it was, or in my experience anyway, it was generally you would go to the seances to help the medium develop their spirit team, not to communicate with a deceased loved one or anything like that, but to develop this particular medium's, group of spirits. So it's quite different, really. It's much more private, and it's much less oriented towards, providing proof of survival after death for loved ones, and is much more interested in exploring the phenomena of mediumship, and trying to provoke or to induce physical effects, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I've read about that type of stuff from back in the the peak years of spiritualism and stuff with ectoplasm, and I never, honestly, I just thought that stuff was mostly faked, and that's why it wasn't done anymore. But according to what you've experienced, that may not be the case.
Exactly. Yeah, it's still going on. I mean, we can think about these things in terms of the kind of a history of physical mediumship. So like you said, it really came to prominence in the Victorian era with the spiritualist movement. I mean, the Fox sisters, the two girls who kind of spurred the modern spiritualist movement, the phenomena that were associated with them were physical phenomena. So, spiritualism began with raps and knocks and things like that.
Yeah.
It began with physical effects. And gradually, as the movement kind of developed, and as it spread across America, well, actually, it started off in New York State, so it was already pretty far.
Yeah, it started off not far from here, actually.
Excellent, yeah, in Hydesville.
Yep.
And, it spread across the Atlantic to Europe. And as it did that, the forms of phenomena kind of changed a bit, and they became more diverse. And mediums all of a sudden were able to, materialize deceased loved ones and things like that. So, it sounds like a ramping up of kind of parlor games, that it gets more, the phenomena get more intense and more kind of spectacular. But one of the most interesting things about it is that, at the tail end of the 19th century, there was loads of, psychical researchers, eminent scientists, people like Charles Richet, people who had spent their life developing, new approaches in biology and things like that, who came then to, Charles Richet even won a Nobel Prize. And they would go to these physical seances, and they were absolutely adamant that, based on their observations, that ectoplasm was a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
So even though it started off as kind of like a ramping up of the physical phenomena, starting off with rocks and then becoming, raps and bangs, and becoming much more kind of elaborate, there was sort of solid evidence for, or at least anecdotal evidence, that mediums were doing extraordinary things in seances. So it's super interesting. And it died out in the 1940s. The last, one of the last great physical mediums in Britain was the medium Helen Duncan. I'm not sure if you've heard of her before. She was actually the last person to be trialed with the Witchcraft Act.
Right, okay.
Yeah, during World War II, because they thought that she was bringing through the spirits of deceased naval officers or something, and they thought that her mediumship demonstrations were a threat to national security, and arrested her.
Wow.
So it became kind of all jumbled up with ideas of like criminality, and with ideas about fraud and things like that. Slightly earlier in the 1920s and 30s, there was the famous Marjorie mediumship in America, right. And Houdini was involved in, exposing the fraud involved in that. So physical mediumship just became, in the popular imagination, kind of bound up with ideas about crime and fraud and trickery and those kind of things. And it just sort of, it disappeared. And there was a kind of interesting double element of this, because it became so negatively associated that no one wanted to develop it anymore. Spiritualists didn't want to go through the process of developing physical mediumship just to be, exposed or to have people attempting to debunk you all the time. And then the researchers stopped being interested in it because they didn't want to associate themselves with something that was, linked with fraud and criminality. So it kind of just disappeared for a few years. It went down into the underground, and mental mediumship took prominence because it's much less extravagant, but also I think in terms of like proving the existence of deceased loved ones, mental mediumship actually provides slightly better evidence. So it became much more popular.
Right.
And then in the 1990s, there was a kind of a renewed interest in physical mediumship. And you get groups like, the Scole group, who come along, and they say that they actually try and revolutionize physical mediumship. So, we're not using ectoplasm anymore like the old Victorian mediums used to use. We're using a new form of energy that's much cleaner and much safer. So they're trying to open the way for new, the development of new physical mediumship. And this kind of, it spreads. The Scole experiment was quite an influential study, and there was 2 famous books published about it. One by the Society for Psychical Research, and the other was a more popular kind of journalistic approach. People would read that then and think that I want to set up my own physical groups to try and produce or reproduce some of these, lights and things and materializations and stuff. So they would all get in contact with people like Robin Foy from the Scole group and other new mediumship groups. Like there's a group called Jenny's Sanctuary in the UK that's been very influential. And my group, the Bristol Spirit Lodge, they took direct inspiration from Jenny's Sanctuary in Banbury, and they borrowed their same sort of protocols and the way they set up the seance room and all of that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting that although there was this gap in physical mediumship, in the practice of it, and all of these associations with fraud and things, towards the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, there was a new resurgence of interest in physical mediumship. And some people call this the new age of physical mediumship. And today, the Bristol Spirit Lodge will be a part of that new wave of physical mediums. But today, probably the most prominent of the new age of physical mediumship, or physical mediums, is the German medium Kai Mügger. I don't know if you've encountered them in the Felix experimental group.
No, I haven't.
I know Shannon Taggart, the photographer, has taken some wonderful photos in seances with the Felix Circle.
Okay, I know who she is.
Yeah. And they produce, allegedly, and you can see in some of the photos as well, classic 19th century style ectoplasm. Full figures they're trying to develop out of ectoplasm.
Right, you talk about this in the book a bit.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that there's this new group of people who are trying to, develop these older paranormal phenomena. It's quite interesting. It's kind of like a cultural, you could think of it as a kind of like a cultural renaissance or something like that. Even though it's a kind of a fringe cultural phenomenon, it still seems to follow the same kinds of patterns of going down into decline and then coming back up again in popularity.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting.
So like when I was growing up, I was mostly exposed to things like Ramtha and Shirley MacLaine and stuff like that. So I had a hard time taking any of it seriously until I picked up one of the Seth books.
Yeah.
And the Seth book completely, it bugged me because I'm like, this seems legitimate. This doesn't seem like, this is someone just trying to make money or, putting on a show. This seems like some, and the fact that Jane Roberts approached it with such an open mind where she was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's an exterior entity or part of myself. And I was kind of like, okay, plus he was picking, talking about stuff about the experience of death is where I started with him. And he was talking about stuff that people researching near-death experiences, decades later were only starting to pick up as part of a commonality. And he's talking about it in 71. And I'm like, okay, that's a little hard to just throw out,
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm really interested in channeling because channeling seems to be another kind of offshoot of mediumship.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I really have encountered that much here. Because, the entities that channelers channel are often quite different to the entities that, spiritualist mediums will channel. So they might be, they could be extraterrestrials, or they could identify as interdimensional beings and things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas the spiritualist mediums that I work with generally would say that they were channeling the spirits of deceased, human beings. But there are points where it kind of crosses over. One of the spirits that I met I think actually in the very first seance I went to, was a spirit called Elf. And he claimed to be, well, he didn't say that he was an elf. Obviously his name was Elf.
Right.
But he did say that he'd never been incorporated in a physical body before. And he kind of performed this like trickster-like role within his spirit team. So while the other spirits in the spirit team were kind of, they were human spirits and they were interested in expressing their kind of like philosophy from the other side and all of the things that they'd learned and that kind of stuff. Elf was much more kind of playful, and he didn't like to be pinned down. And he would just say things over and over again, like, I am me, I am free, I just be. Which is pretty interesting.
What got you interested in this stuff to begin with?
Yeah, well, I've been interested in the paranormal for a long time, and I usually, when people ask me that, I trace my interest back to some of my earlier experiences, and one of them was my I'm not sure whether I mentioned it before, my psychedelic experience when I was younger. And I saw with magic mushrooms, and I saw these what seemed to be kind of like fairies, or these beings that seemed to be different from the rest of the kind of psychedelic stuff that was going on around them. And they seemed to have kind of like their own intentionality, and they were directed, and they were moving along in a procession. I should say they were two-dimensional beings in the grain of a drawer that was hanging out of a chest of drawers. And they kind of clocked me. The leader of this procession saw me, kind of turned to look at me, and then just sort of obviously decided I wasn't worth thinking about and carried on with the procession. But, for me, it was this experience of seeing something that seemed independent in some way, or it seemed to be doing its own thing.
Yeah.
And that kind of challenged me for quite a long time. And when I went to university, I was still interested in thinking about, what could these things be? What are spirits? Why are there things that, generally we don't see in our everyday life? Like God, for example, but that we still nevertheless, or, human beings in general, still change their behavior and do things for these invisible beings.
Right.
And that was kind of the starting question when I finished my degree, my first degree, my undergraduate degree. That's what my dissertation was about. I found this group, the Bristol Spirit Lodge. Why do they believe in spirits? And the ultimate conclusion I came to was because they in the context of seances, and they have experiences of spirits. So I came to a kind of an experiential understanding of mediumship, that the whole tradition is based around people having experiences, just like I had the experience of seeing, fairies under the influence of psychedelics.
Yeah.
So lots of other people have experiences of what they take to be, the spirits of deceased loved ones, or, different kinds of discarnate spirits in the context of seances. So that it kind of makes seances into an experiential kind of learning space.
Yeah, you've definitely changed the way I look at all of this stuff with just from reading this book. I over the years I've become more open-minded to it, but it's the stuff the way you look at it in this book is just fascinating. And one of the things you're doing too is you're sort of like looking to define some of this stuff differently. And I can't remember who said it, but someone had made the comment that like this stuff shouldn't be called supernatural or paranormal. It's just more rare than other experiences.
Yeah. There's lots of interesting debates about how to talk about these kinds of things, because obviously, they seem to hint at something more than the everyday world that we usually experience. It suggests that there's something else going on there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, science and the way that we go about building up knowledge, it likes to have things that are concrete and that we can, put into a nice, neat box and categorize. But the paranormal or the supernatural doesn't seem to want that. It doesn't seem to want to fit into any kind of the categories that we try to put together to make sense of the world. So it's a really interesting sort of, it's an interesting case study, thinking about different ways of conceiving of reality, I suppose. There's lots of different approaches that you can take within it. And, psychical researchers, parapsychologists, spiritualists have all taken their own different approaches. So my approach has been to look at all of these different approaches and try and find out what is the kind of like, what can we sort of filter out from all of that stuff? What's really going on in these situations?
And you talk a lot in the book about how a lot of Western anthropologists will go into this with, well, this stuff doesn't exist, so we're just going to study it from that angle, where you're suggesting we should study it from, and any of this stuff, whether we're studying other cultures or whatever, from the perspective of the people we're studying it, not from this haughty sort of materialistic, we know what's real and what's not sort of attitude. Yeah. I mean, for all of the goodness of anthropology and trying to, get out into the world and bring back information from different cultures and things, it's quite an open-minded discipline, really. Yeah. And it has always dealt with, religion and spirits and things like that. But for the most part, the explanations have been kind of reductive explanations. They try to explain, they might have an underlying, like you're saying, a materialist framework. So ultimately, there's no scope within the materialist model for, discarnate spirits. Therefore, any kind of spirit mediumship or things like that must be, either fraudulent or the product of, medical kind of physical problems. It could be brain damage, or it could be drugs or things like that. These are the kind of like the standard materialist explanations. But my approach has been to say, well, there's a whole parallel tradition that runs alongside anthropology, and that started off in the 19th century in a similar kind of way to anthropology as well. And that is, psychical research and parapsychology. So anthropology has spent, the last 150 years thinking about spirits and all of these different phenomena in terms of a materialist explanation, in terms of, social functions and psychological functions, what these things do for people in societies and how they bind societies together and all of that, which is fair enough, but it's not the whole picture. And psychical research and parapsychology has spent the last 150 years investigating these same or similar kinds of things, mediumship and so on, but with the aim of trying to understand what the underlying, ontological nature of this phenomenon is. Right.
So parapsychologists have been concerned with psi and spirits and providing empirical evidence for that. And they have amassed some data over this 150 years. Some of it's controversial, obviously, but some of it's also quite robust.
Yeah.
So my idea was, and it's not my idea solely, but there are other anthropologists have done this as well. But my approach has been to then try to weave in this parapsychological data into, the anthropological theorizing. Because if the data from parapsychology is correct, and there are discarnate spirits, or we do have psi capacities and things like that, then all of those standard anthropological approaches, that are focused on reductive materialist explanations, or that are focused on just social and psychological functions and things like that, are lacking, because they haven't taken into consideration the fact that there is evidence for genuine psi, evidence for the possibility of spirits and things.
Yeah, and
so it just blows open the water for anthropology, I think.
And the scientific evidence for psi is actually really strong. It's just that the mainstream, the materialist establishment does not want to acknowledge it.
Yeah, because it's a challenge. It's suggesting that actually maybe non-physical processes have got some kind of a fundamental importance.
Yeah.
Where obviously the materialist view is that there is nothing beyond the physical. So yeah, I think the evidence from parapsychology is pretty strong, really. I mean, by all the standards of other sciences in terms of statistics and things like that, even the meta-analyses that they do now, where they look at, multiple studies and look at the trends across, many, many different studies, there are still positive, statistically significant effects revealed. So it suggests that, all of our standard approaches to things like religion and mediumship and, whatever, all of the magico-religious spiritual practices, from an anthropological perspective at least, and sociological perspectives, need to be reevaluated, because there's a whole dimension of them that, that anthropologists and sociologists have ignored, which is the genuine psi phenomena angle.
Yeah. And you're talking here about, like, and this is really fascinating to me, like the physiological studies, the EEGs and things like that, that do not show what you would expect to see when people are going into trance states and stuff like this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. There's been some studies of mediums doing automatic writing, for example. And, when we do writing in our normal, up at normal in inverted commas, in our normal waking state of consciousness, and you do an EEG or some other kind of brain imaging, you can see that there are certain areas of the brain that will light up, where there'll be increased blood flow, or where there'll be increased electrical activity.
Right.
So, areas that are associated with, movement of hands, but also, processing of language and things like that as well. But when they did this same, standard kind of study with automatic writers, so mediums who would go into a trance and then allow spirits to write through them, they found actually decreases in activity in those places where you would normally expect to see an increase in activity. So actually the areas to do with, language and hand control and whatever, I'm probably, remembering it slightly wrongly, but the basic gist is there.
Yeah.
That these particular areas, there was a decrease in activity at the peak of their kind of trance states as well. So that when they're going into these states, they're not actually, lighting up areas of the brain subconsciously. Actually, it's more like key areas of the brain are shutting down and allowing something else to flow through, perhaps. It's really interesting because there were similar studies a few years ago with psilocybin, and they used to think that, the standard model of psychedelic action was that psychedelics would, if you did a brain study of someone in the depths of their mushroom trip or their, acid trip, that you would see the brain lighting up and flashing all over the place, that it was kind of like an overload of the brain.
Right.
That was the standard model. But actually what they found was that, when they administer psilocybin, it leads to, decreases in activity. So it's kind of like a shutting down of the brain's normal function. And that suggests, a model of mind-body interaction, more kind of like the filter kind of Henri Bergson kind of model, or Aldous Huxley, the brain as a reducing valve for consciousness. So that when we take a psychedelic, it's reducing the normal activity of the brain, which kind of filters things out and actually allows a greater flood of maybe external inputs or something. I'm not really sure, but it's interesting that it's a reduction of brain activity.
Yeah, well, I mean, our brain filters out most of reality for us. Yeah.
So if you can switch off the filter, then in theory, you would get a deluge of other sensory material that you don't usually have access to.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because in the case of the automatic writers, then it's suggesting that maybe this writing, at the very least, when the medium says that it's not them that's doing the writing, at the very least that's, phenomenologically true for them, because they don't have the experience of being the writer.
Yeah.
Because their brain isn't doing it. Super interesting.
Yeah, no, it really is. And it's hard to argue with, too. That's the other thing.
Well, I mean, it's neurophysiological data, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it just, what it suggests to me, it doesn't necessarily prove the existence of spirits or anything like that, but it does suggest that, mediumship and these kinds of practices need to be reevaluated. The old Victorian and 19th, early 20th century approach of debunking these things is not the right foot to start off on, is it?
Yeah.
And actually, there's good data to show that these are genuine practices that have real physiological effects. So it opens up the debate again. What's actually going on here then? If it's not operating in the manner that we assumed that it was operating in, then what's going on?
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of my other jumping off points, is that there's definitely something going on here. But what?
As you describe some of this, the seance stuff, I mean, some of it I think would come across to people as just outright silly.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm not trying to, I wouldn't want to say that it is the most, like spiritually enlightened practice or anything like that, or that it is some kind of like, I don't think, I wouldn't even really think of it as kind of like a spiritual path. Some people might, and some of the people that I spoke to on my in my fieldwork thought of it as a spiritual path, a part of their kind of process of development. But actually, the way I see it is as something that humans do, or something that humans have a capacity for going into these different states of consciousness.
Yeah.
So, if we kind of, in a way, separate out all of the spiritual connotations and things like that, and focus on it as a thing that happens, then it means that we can kind of start from a blank slate and explore it in new different ways. So if you start off from the neurophysiological angle, that's a robust materialist scientific position to begin from. And if you begin from that place, then you're already starting off from a strange place, because the mediumship seems to do something that, beyond the standard model, which is cool.
You write at one point that the contribution cognitive science can make to any general understanding of religion or to the study of particular religious traditions is necessarily ancillary and roughly equivalent to the contribution that technical knowledge about materials can make to aesthetics in the history of art. And I thought that was perfect right there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it can only tell us so much.
Yeah.
And then there's the actual, the phenomenology of it, the actual experience, what it feels like to have these strange, to enter into these strange neurophysiological states. And that, again, that's when spirits and things start to come into it, because, you could do a brain scan, find out that a medium, the medium's brain is kind of shutting down in a way, and then leave it at that. Or you could then ask, well, what does that feel like to the medium? What kinds of things, does the medium experience when this happens? And, we know what the answers are. The medium oftentimes will experience themselves in another space separate from their body, or they'll say that, I'm not under my body is not under my control when I'm in these states. Something else is in control of my body, and all those kind of things. So it opens up then the question, and it provides a space within academic thinking and all of that stuff to entertain these possibilities. The neurophysiological data is suggesting this, and then you ask the people what their experiences are when they're in these particular neurophysiological states, then you ultimately are going to have to deal with the question of, well, what are these spirits that people claim, take over their bodies and things like that? What's the nature of this experience?
So, what was I just? So you mentioned the Scole experiment earlier. Can you tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was an experiment in the 90s, in the early 90s, based in Norfolk in the UK, in a small town called Scole, and it was established by a guy called Robin Foy, I think his wife as well. And basically, they had a cellar in their house, and they thought that it would be a good place to try out some seances, and they did, and they made contact with, again, like a group of spirits or a spirit team, who, if I remember correctly, claimed to be scientists. So a lot of them claimed to be the spirits that they were communicating with, allegedly, claimed to be early psychical researchers, chemists, and things like that, who were interested in life, in making a bridge between the spirit world and the physical world. And now that they are deceased, they're continuing that quest. And basically what they were doing was trying to demonstrate that, that they existed. And they were doing all of these extraordinary, well, allegedly again, physical phenomena. So making lights appear and things like that. What's the word? With film, like photographic film.
Oh yeah.
Exposing photographic films. That's what I'm trying to say. With strange images of spectral landscapes and bits of writing and fancy like handwritten poetry and stuff. So they produced allegedly all of these extraordinary things, and they also invited in researchers, people from the Society for Psychical Research, to come and document some of this stuff. And I think this is why it's such a famous and influential case, because there was a lot of publicity around it, and there was actually researchers in there who were documenting it. And like I said before, they wrote up a report for the Society for Psychical Research, but then there was also this popular book that was published about it as well. And that's what led to this resurgence of physical mediumship. People reading about this and thinking, oh, I could try that as well. Yeah.
One of the seances you went to in this group was with a guy named Warren, who had some really impressive physical stuff go on. Yeah.
Yeah, Warren is he's quite well known in the physical mediumship, in the new age of physical mediumship. Now, at the time, I think when I first started to attend seances, it was about 10 years ago now. So at the time, I think he was still gaining reputation. But it's quite a tricky thing. His phenomena were impressive, but the very fact that they were of this kind of extra magnitude, like lights that I'd seen in previous seances had, spirit lights, or what I'd taken to be spirit lights, had been almost semi-subjective, hallucinatory kind of lights.
Yeah.
So I see small flashes of light in the seance and things like that, and that's impressive enough and interesting enough. But with seances like Warren's, the lights are almost too physical. I couldn't in that instance, I couldn't rule out the possibility, for example, that it was a torch.
Okay.
I couldn't prove that it was a torch, and I couldn't prove that it wasn't a torch. But the light is that physical that it appears that way. And it, in other seances where it's a kind of semi-subjective light, you're like, well, I can definitely rule out it being a torch because it's not the same kind of thing. But with Warren's seances, it becomes much more tricky, and they feel quite different as well to the normal mediumship development sessions that go on at the lodge. But yeah, there are things about his mediumship demonstrations that I found really impressive. So like the feeling of a sense of presence that some of his spirit team had. So in particular, there's a spirit called Luther that he has, who is he presents in the seance room as very massive, really, an enormous big spirit. And you get the feeling in the seance that this giant spirit is present. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that spirit is present, but in the context of the seance and the participation of all the people in that moment, then Luther becomes a real kind of social character in the moment anyway.
Yeah.
So there's lots of interesting things like that to do with his mediumship. And then there was other things like the lights that kind of throw the whole thing into question and make you wonder. Another example would be ectoplasm.
Yeah.
And there was one occasion when, Warren was doing his seance, and one of the spirits is asking, does everyone want to see ectoplasm? And then all the sitters obviously say, yes, we'd love to see ectoplasm. So the spirit said, okay, turn off the lights. And then they turn off the lights and they put the music on, and then it's like, you can hear a bit of like rumble, tumbling going on, some movement. And then he says, right, do you want to turn the lights on and see the ectoplasm? And so they turn the lights on, and we could see coming out of the cabinet, which is a curtained off corner of the seance room, where the medium sits, there was this thin strip of something that was coming out through the curtains of the cabinet and attached to the top of one of the spirit trumpets. Spirit trumpets in spiritualist mediumship are like an aluminium cone basically, and spirits will talk through it, or they allegedly talk through it. And this strip of silk or something was coming out from the cabinet and was attached to the top of the cone. And then the spirit said, do you want to see it move? And everyone said, yes, we'd love to see it move. So he said, okay, turn off the lights again. So we had to turn off the lights. And then when he told us to turn the lights back on, this strip of stuff was basically just waggling around. And, it looked like, for all intents and purposes, a piece of silk that was being waggled about by someone by hand. It was very unimpressive. And it really didn't leave me feeling like, yes, I've just seen genuine ectoplasm, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, that said, one instance of, fake ectoplasm doesn't mean that the whole of, that whole body of literature that's out there about, people like Richer and Schrenk-Notzing and all of those guys who did long and detailed experiments with this alleged substance, and they claimed that it was real. So, it's, for me, there's still the possibility that ectoplasm is real, even though my experience of it has generally not been very convincing.
I would think it would be a rarer sort of thing than any of the other stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It is.
I mean, even more so than like an apport or something, which is a normal physical object. This is almost like a supernatural material, is it?
Exactly.
Material.
Yeah. It's very extraordinary.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think actually, there is some pretty good evidence that in certain circumstances that something unusual is produced, something ectoplasmic. There's too much evidence, anecdotal, and also cross-cultural evidence, which I found interesting. The fact that, we might think of ectoplasm as a very Western spiritualist phenomenon. But actually there are parallel phenomena in different cultures. So, for example, in South American shamanic traditions in the Amazon rainforest, the ayahuasqueros, people who, dish out the ayahuasca and consume the ayahuasca, will produce a kind of a magical phlegm, which they extract, like darts and things from, poison darts. So this magical phlegm produced by the shamans is kind of similar idea to ectoplasm. It's a bodily secretion that has a kind of, like you're saying, a supernatural, paranormal quality.
Mm-hmm.
There's another example from Australia, Aboriginal Australian tradition. An anthropologist called Ronald Rose, who did detailed studies of the psychic lives of Aboriginal Australians in like the 1950s, which is pretty amazing. And he talked about this magic rope that the clever men, Australian Aboriginal clever men, would produce. And this rope would come out of the mouth of the clever man,
mm-hmm.
and it would move around in the sand, kind of like a snake, like as if it had its own, it was in control of itself, this substance that was coming out of the body. And it sounds a lot like what the spiritualists and what the psychical researchers called pseudopods in ectoplasmic mediumship. A pseudopod is a term that comes from cellular biology. Again, Charles Richet used a lot of ideas, including ectoplasm as well. The word itself comes from cellular biology. If you look at a picture of a cell, a diagram of a cell, you can see where the ectoplasm is in the cell. And you can see a pseudopod, which is like an extension of the cell outwards into a kind of like a leg or a limb. So this Australian Aboriginal magic rope sound a lot like a pseudopod from the Victorian mediumship seances, which is also very interesting. So the fact that there are parallels in different cultures that seem to be describing, I mean, admittedly, the evidence is pretty scant from what I've been able to find, but there is some evidence there.
Yeah.
That, it could be something that is more than just a product of Victorian culture, that actually it might be a genuine human capacity.
And when you talk about the darts, are they sort of, are the darts manifesting out of the ectoplasm, or are they just coating the darts with ectoplasm?
Good question. I'm not entirely sure of the specifics, but
okay.
the impression I got from what I was reading was that the darts were kind of like apports.
Okay.
Extracted from the substance, but it could be wrong. But definitely just the association of a substance that's exuded from the body that is sort of a spiritual substance is a very interesting, similar kind of, it's a parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea of like trickery and tricksterism in this stuff, it seems to go hand in hand, and it doesn't necessarily disprove it. I always felt like with people like what's his name? I've completely blanked on his name. That Randy used to go after him all the time.
Uri Geller.
Yes. So Geller, seemed to have some history of actually being able to do the stuff in labs. But, I'm thinking, okay, when you're out there on stage, you can't not, perform.
Yeah.
And so, he may have been using trickery and stuff. And then you'd have the amazing Randy sitting there going, well, you could do it this way. And I'm like, but just because you can do it that way, you didn't prove he's doing it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I think there's a complicated relationship between, what we've seen with George Hansen's work, the trickster and the paranormal. That paranormal phenomena seem to have this kind of playful, childlike, trickster-like quality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is quite a close association between the paranormal and things like fraud and trickery. So in the book, I do a lot of talking about how maybe, fraud, performance, and trickery and things like that are actually part of the process of manifesting genuine paranormal phenomena. It's weird. It almost sounds like a bit of a get out of jail free card, saying saying that, well, there's fraud and genuine phenomena, but the evidence again seems to point in that direction.
Yeah.
So, for example, something that I found that I was really interested in was the work of parapsychologist called Kenneth Batchelor, and he did a lot of research on spiritualist style physical mediumship and table tipping and things like that. And he found that when he was setting up these experimental physical seances where they were doing things like table tipping, that if he introduced, he called them artifacts, or an artifact is like a faked phenomenon. If he introduced a small faked effect, like if he lifted the table himself once, then subsequently they would find genuine effects. So in terms of the group dynamic, in manifesting these phenomena, if they see something, a trick or something like that, that for the moment that they see it convinces them or makes them believe in the moment that these things are possible, that then after that, genuine things do occur. So he kind of thinks about these artifacts that he was introducing into these seances as kind of like kickstarters, for the genuine thing. And that you need to have that moment of belief in the moment, not necessarily a long-term belief, which is the interesting thing that he points out, but that you believe in it, that it's happening in the moment that it's happening, then that is the point at which genuine phenomena occur. So this is really interesting when we start to look at things like, shamanism and spirit possession cross-culturally, because both of these practices, although they're very diverse and there's lots of different traditions, but they both make use of performance, in one way or another. So, you might look at, for example, like Korean shamans or things like that, and they'll stand on blades and things to show that they are, genuinely in a trance. So there's a performative aspect there. And the fact, when they go and stand on these blades and they don't bleed and things like that, that has an effect on the people who are watching, who think, well, if they're able to do this, then, that must mean that the spirit is genuinely present in their body. And so the moment of instant belief is generated. They believe because they're seeing with their own eyes that something extraordinary is happening. And that feeds into this collective, experience. And may even, if we take what spirits say seriously in these kind of contexts, they say that they need this kind of social energy in order to manifest. Right. They need people to be engaged and interested and, involved in a dialogue in order for these things to work. So it's very interesting that, performance and trickery and illusions and magic and all of those kind of things can be used in this way as one of the ways I've framed it is as a modulator of consciousness. You
also compare it to the placebo effect as well, which makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, again, the placebo effect is related, to your belief in the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
About whether something is going to be effective or not. And it's more your mind over matter, really, than any kind of physical effect that's taking place. And there's a section in the book that looks at, that considers mediumship or physical mediumship as a form of, what do I call it? Extraordinary mind-body phenomena.
Right.
So there's all sorts of other interesting mind-body phenomena in the literature that we can look at for parallels with physical mediumship. And one of the ones I talk about is stigmata, in Catholicism. And in stigmata, as we probably already know, but, people who are devout believers begin to manifest the signs of, Jesus' crucifixion. And the interesting thing about it is that they manifest signs of the crucifixion, not necessarily as it actually happened, because,
right.
There's lots of debate about, where the nails would have been pinned and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
But they manifest the symptoms of the crucifixion as they perceive them in art and in, popular culture and places like that.
Right.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a book by Ian Wilson called The Bleeding Mind about stigmata, which is really interesting. And he says that you didn't get stigmata occurring until until I can't remember the exact date, something like in the 15th century or something, when they had a cultural shift in the way that they depicted the crucifixion. So when they started to depict the crucifixion quite graphically, and quite realistically, so when the art style changed and it became more, realistic, that's when people started to manifest the stigmata. Once they'd seen it, once it had been allowed as a valid expression within the culture, it starts to manifest. And I think we could argue similar things, like within the context of the culture of spiritualism. It's kind of expected that spirits should manifest, or it's expected that there should be ectoplasm and all those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And that expectation and belief feeds into it in quite a powerful way. Another place where this parallels with, more mainstream kind of ideas is in terms of mental health. So there's a really interesting book called Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the Western Mind. And in that book, Ethan Watters is the author. He talks about how mental illnesses, things like anorexia and things like that, are actually kind of like culturally transmitted. And he talks about, he draws from the guy, I can't remember his first name now, Shorter is his second name, but he had this idea of symptom pools, so that a culture can have a pool of culturally recognized symbols or symptoms of distress that they can draw on in order to express their, illness, their distress. Yeah. So a symptom, a good example would be like in the Victorian times when they had hysteria. Hysteria was a label that was given actually to a whole range of different symptoms. So sometimes people would like go into fits, or they would have paralyses or things like that, or they would, they would go into a coma. All of these were understood in the Victorian times as symptoms that there was some kind of a distress going on. So it's not surprising that you have a whole load of people who, draw on those same symptoms and manifest them. And I think the same is true again for, different physical mediumship traditions, that they have a symptom pool that they draw on. Physical ectoplasmic materializations is a part of that symptom pool. Mm-hmm. Other things would be like, body parts growing and shrinking. There's evidence of that from lots of different seances of people seeing hands like suddenly going really big or shrinking. And again, these are, symptoms. They're recognized behaviors. So it's an interesting thing. This idea that, our culture and our cultural expectations can have a very sort of real physical manifestation in the right kinds of circumstances.
And there's cases of people with dissociative disorder where things like eye color and stuff will change depending on which personality is in control.
Yeah, and even the bodily, the strength and the posture of the bodies. I mean, this is true of mediums as well. When they are embodying a particular spirit, then they change their physical demeanor. They become, like if they're incorporating someone who is very big, then they'll puff their body up, and so it's a very physical thing as well, which is quite interesting.
I mean, I feel like at this point, the way I look at all this stuff is that we don't fully grasp what we're capable of when it comes to manipulating reality around us. I mean, there's obviously a shared reality that we have, but it seems like culturally that changes, and that we could potentially, just have massive effects on what we think of as material reality.
Yeah, I think we do. But it's often more subtle as it manifests in our everyday lives and in a seance or something where you're doing a concerted effort to bring something about. But I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? We look at the world around us and the ecological crisis and all this kind of stuff. It is a manifestation of our culture.
Yeah.
It's an externalization of Western culture's beliefs for the last 200 years or so, to do with consumption of resources and unrestrained economic growth and all of that kind of stuff. They're all beliefs, and they manifest in the real world in very physical ways, just the same way that ectoplasm manifests from people's beliefs about ectoplasm.
Yeah.
So ecological crisis is manifested out of our beliefs about our role in the world and our place in the cosmos and that kind of stuff. So you're right. It's our beliefs and cultures have a very real physical influence.
Quick question actually before we get to this one. But what do you make of people claiming to be famous people when they come through in these sessions?
It's interesting. I have tried to deal with this in the book a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the ideas is that that I've played with is that it's easier for very distinctive personalities to manifest quicker because they're instantly recognizable. So if you have someone who comes through, say like Winston Churchill, for example, he's a regular visitor to seances all across the world. He has a very distinctive, image and a very distinctive kind of voice. You kind of recognize it straight away. And I think in a sense, having that kind of a strong cultural template for these spirits makes it easier for them to manifest. And that raises another problem. Is it actually the spirit of Winston Churchill that's manifesting? Or is it, like a thought form or is it the cultural caricature of Winston Churchill that's manifesting in seances?
Yeah.
I think, there's something interesting going on there, which would explain why you get these celebrities coming through. They provide a rigid kind of archetype that's ready-made and easily identifiable, whereas any kind of normal spirit trying to manifest, or maybe, another way of thinking about this is that perhaps these spirits are not, they're not who they claim to be.
Right.
That we are, whenever we creating them from scratch.
Well, I lost you there for a moment. Whenever we what?
Yeah, so maybe whenever we're bringing through spirits in these seances, we're creating them from scratch. So if you've got a strong cultural idea about, for example, Winston Churchill, it's much easier to get that up to a communicable level quite quickly, because you can interact with it.
True.
A new spirit that's trying to manifest, then you don't have anything to go by. And I've described this process, how the circle leader kind of picks up on small things in order to build up a spirit presence. So they might pick up on, a twitching leg to begin with, and then they'll hone in on that and they'll say, right, I can see that the leg's twitching. If you're a spirit that's trying to manifest, can you twitch the leg 3 times, for example? And it builds up like that. But there's no kind of character or personality to frame it in yet. And that builds up over time. Whereas if you start off with the model of Winston Churchill and you give the label to the twitching leg, and that's Winston Churchill from the very beginning, then the whole process can happen much quicker, maybe.
Yeah.
But again, that's not saying that it's genuinely Winston Churchill. It might just be, whatever it is that's going on in these situations.
Well,
part of the medium or some other kind of consciousness in nature or whatever it is.
You talk about the concept of self and the different ways we view ourselves, and I think I suspect anyway that our conscious selves is just a small sliver of everything that is out there, and I don't like, it amazes me that people don't make sense of that, because like when you're dreaming, it's not the same as normal reality. There's plenty of things you do that you have no conscious awareness of, like the sort of robot takes over of the things you do routinely. There's so much just in the obvious way that we don't, our sense of self is kind of divided up.
Yeah, you're right. There's in anthropology, they talk about a Western self and a non-Western self. And it's a very simplistic way of thinking, obviously, and I'll explain why it doesn't really work to think in those kind of discrete distinctions in a minute. But the basic gist is that the Western self, as we find in European and American societies, but also increasingly in non-Western societies as well, through the influence of globalization and proliferation of Western media and ideas and things like that. But the Western self is an individual, so bounded. The Western self basically goes as far as the boundaries of the skin.
Right.
So it's kind of like a physical way of thinking about the self. And the self is an individual, maybe located in the brain, things like that. Whereas the non-Western self that anthropologists have written about, from observations of non-Western societies, is usually more kind of thought of in terms of like porosity, so that it's that the boundaries between the self and other selves are permeable and things can move in and out of them. Or the boundary, there is no like solid boundary between myself and the world around me, so that, my surroundings can influence me, my family members can influence me, or even spirits and things like that. If you believe that God or spirits can communicate with you through your mind, then, you're demonstrating a more porous idea of the self, a self that can be influenced by external things.
Yeah.
So these are these two models, the Western and the non-Western self. Okay, but in my research, my research is based not in like a non-Western society or in a tribal group or anything like that, but in a suburban, modern contemporary suburban house in Bristol, basically. And these, other than their practice of mediumship and things like that, these people who are attending the Bristol Spirit Lodge are, thoroughly Western individuals. They watch TV, they go to the supermarket, and, they go to their jobs and all of those kind of things, living normal Western lives, normal in inverted commas, because there isn't any normal.
Right.
But then when you start to talk to them about seances and their involvement in mediumship and ask them how they think about the nature of the self, then it starts to become clear that, their model of the self is actually much closer to what anthropologists have called a non-Western model of the self than it is to the standard, Western individual model of the self. So what it suggests is that, these models are not, they're not exclusive. It's not like the Western model of the self only occurs in the Western context and the non-Western model only occurs in non-Western context.
Right.
Actually, it's more like the experiences that we have, and this is my angle on it. I talk about the experiential self rather than a cultural self, is that, we build up our model of the self through our experiences in the world. And, if we have psychedelic experiences or, mediumship experiences or whatever, maybe like hang gliding or, mountain climbing or every experience that we have reveals to us aspects of ourselves, of who we are. And this helps to understand why paranormal experiences and mystical experiences and things like that seem to exceed the cultural expectation, because it's not really to do with culture.
Yeah.
Although I've just been talking about the role of culture in modulating experiences and all of that kind of stuff. But actually the self is pre-cultural, it's experiential. So we can be taught that the self is individual, you know, as we grow up in Western society, but then we might have an experience that pushes beyond that. And we start to realize that actually the self is much more complicated, and, you know, there are aspects of the self that we haven't unlocked yet, or we haven't explored thoroughly.
Yeah.
So, you know, this non-Western self then is perhaps, you know, the norm to a certain extent. It's just that it lies dormant, it's unexplored. And if you are, you know, if you are brought up to think that the self is only, you know, the individual, is only the body, then you don't explore.
Right.
You don't go to those, you don't go into those other states of consciousness.
And we have this sort of almost aggressive, atheistic, materialist paradigm that is being like pushed in Western cultures at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And all of that kind of shuts down any attempts at, you know, exploring the nature of the self. Actually, what it does, it gives us a prescribed, you know, norm or expectation about what the self should be.
Yeah. And
anyone who deviates from that then is, you know, it's an abnormal state. It's a disorder. So it's quite interesting, this idea of the self and how we think about it, and, you know, whether it is something that is just taught to us, whether it's a cultural product, which, you know, there are definitely cultural models of the self, but then there's also the experiential side of things, the way that we actually experience ourselves, which is often much more kind of diverse and weird and unusual than the cultural models.
Yes, to say the least.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things you talked about in here too was the fact that, and I'm trying to remember exactly how you phrased it. They were doing laboratory tests with someone, and the symbols didn't mean much to them. But then when they changed out the symbols to be meaningful to the person they were testing with, they got better results. Yeah.
This is from the work of Patrick Giesler, I think, an anthropologist, who in the 1980s, he was doing research on, he was calling it parapsychological anthropology, which is really cool. And he was doing basically parapsychological experiments, but in ethnographic contexts, you know, so with tribal communities and things like that, doing standard kind of parapsychological experiments. But, you know, he found that when you try to do that and you try to bring in, you know, experiments that have been designed for the Western mind, you know, or people who were brought up in a Western culture, that, you know, the symbols that are used, you know, for example, in like a Zener card experiment, you know, the symbols that are used in there, that although they are kind of, you know, they're kind of neutral symbols, aren't they?
Yeah.
But they're still culturally significant. You know, we recognize them as, you know, a wave, or we recognize it as a triangle or whatever.
Yeah.
But what they found was that when they were trying to replicate these Western experiments in non-Western contexts, that these symbols had no relevance to, you know, the people that were doing the experiment. So they were having negative results in the experiments, or the experiments just were not working because they didn't have any kind of connection to the symbols that were used. And what he found was that if he used symbols that were culturally meaningful, you know, and it's kind of obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
If he used symbols or ideas that had a relevance within the culture, then, you know, the hit rates would go up because they had meaning to them. So there's no point, the general argument that Giesler's making is there's no point trying to impose, you know, Western experimental processes, onto non-Western cultures, because, you know, there's going to be a clash. And the experiment's not going to work in the way that it's meant to work.
Well, they were saying Jeffrey Kripal said at one point, and I think the exact quote was that strange things happen for a reason in real life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as opposed to doing the stuff in the laboratory where you're trying to kind of like push the stuff, like there's meaning to it a lot of times when it happens. It has a significant effect to you when it just happens spontaneously in your life.
Yeah, definitely. And again, this is one of the things that I've been thinking about for the last 10 years or so, which is, I've talked a little bit about the relationship of parapsychology to anthropology, and it's not just a one-way relationship. So, I've said that anthropology needs to take into account the evidence from parapsychology for mediumship and all those kind of things when it's trying to construct theories about what's going on with spirit possession and that kind of stuff. But also, parapsychology needs to take a little bit of a leaf out of anthropology's book and understand these kind of practices and processes in the ethnographic context in which they occur, in the real life world.
Yeah.
Rather than in the laboratory where it's reduced. And there was an Italian anthropologist called Ernesto De Martino in the 1950s and 60s. And he pointed this out. He's a really interesting guy. He wrote a book called Magic, Primitive and Modern. I think it was published in English in the 70s, but, it was way ahead of his time. And actually funded by the Parapsychology Foundation, which is interesting and cool. But he said that, he pointed this out, like I say, in the 60s or 70s, that the parapsychological experiment is a complete reduction of the normal complexity of paranormal experiences as they occur in the world. And he said they usually occur, like you were saying, in the context of, some kind of an unfolding drama or some kind of a highly emotive kind of event.
Yeah.
So, crisis apparitions, for example, they occur when someone is in mortal danger in the real world. So he's saying that, and that parapsychology needs to get out into the field, like the early psychical researchers used to do, investigating haunted houses and things like that, in the context within which they occur naturally, and not trying to bring it into the laboratory and, put all of the controls in place and all of that kind of stuff, which is necessary for science, experimental science. But it might be detracting from all of these various different kinds of, contextual processes that are going on around paranormal experiences.
Yeah, but the problem too is that because these experiences are so rare, it's not like you can just follow someone around until something strange happens to them,
Yeah, that's it. They are spontaneous experiences. That said, though, there are examples in anthropology where the anthropologists have just been, they're not necessarily there to investigate the paranormal or anything like that, but because they are living in these communities where they are exposed to the experiences. So, for example, there's a good case from Evans Pritchard, one of the most influential anthropologists, where he describes in his book Witchcraft, Oracles and Magic Among the Azandi, his experience of this light that he saw one night when he was outside his hut, and this light was moving along through the kind of the scrubland towards a village in the opposite, in the other direction. And when he told his informants about this light that he'd seen the next day, they all said, "Well, you'd seen witchcraft. That was obviously witchcraft on its way." Mm-hmm. And sure enough, someone in the next village died. The next day they got word of it. But in his ethnography, in his writing up of this, he kind of dismisses the experience and says that it was probably a handful of grass lit by someone on his way to defecate. Right. So it kind of turns it into a bit of a joke. But, the fact that he was an anthropologist on the ground, he had the experience and he wrote about it, was quite an important step forward, even though he kind of poo-pooed it in the end.
Literally.
Literally, yeah. But he provided the bedrock for other anthropologists to come along and, describe their own similar kinds of experiences. So you can do a kind of ethnographic psychical research, if that's what you were trying to do. Another colleague of mine, a guy called Fabian Graham, he is his research has been on spirit possession in Taiwan and these various different kind of East Asian spirit possession traditions. And he has adopted this kind of paraanthropology approach that I've been trying to elaborate, but in the context of these incredible, Thai spirit possession rituals. And, the things that he describes and experiences are, really extraordinary things, but it's because he's participating in it as a, paranthropologist.
Yeah.
He's blurring the lines between anthropology and parapsychology, and the ideas and the experiences that he has that emerge from that are, exciting and challenging and different, and provide a new perspective on these things. So I think it's a fruitful way forward, I think, for paranormal research to embrace this, more anthropological, ethnographic kind of approach.
So we're just about out of time. We're going to do a Patreon segment with you because there's a few more things I want to talk to you about. But where can people find you online, and where the book will be out when?
Yep. You can find me online on my website, which is jack-hunter.webstarts.com. You can also find me on Facebook as well. There's all sorts of different Facebook pages and groups. There's my Dr. Jack Hunter Facebook page, but there's also a Paranthropology Facebook page. And more recently, something I'm involved in is the MA in Ecology and Spirituality. There's a new Facebook page for that as well, which is quite interesting. And then, the book, Manifesting Spirits, should be out, in theory, on Saturday, the 19th.
Okay.
It should become available to order. But things have been, moving a little bit weirdly recently for various reasons. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was slightly delayed a little bit.
Okay.
But so far, everything is looking like it should be out on Saturday.
Awesome. And do you have the Paranthropology Journal too?
I do. It's on a bit of a hiatus, but there's a whole load of free journal issues available at paranthropology.co.uk, or if you just search for Paranthropology on Google, you should be able to find it quite easily. But I'm hoping that to get the journal up and running again in the not too distant future, or maybe passing the baton on to someone else.
All right. Well, thank you. And like I said, we'll do a Patreon segment with you, but thank you for spending this time with us.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.
And I want to take a moment here to send a thank you out to all of my Patreons. It's because of you that this show is possible, and I really mean that. And a special thank you and shout out to those pledging $10 or more: Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Tim, Nagatha Christie, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Johanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Treewell, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Kamahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Taylor, Sam Sharon, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster III, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Sedgder, Dominic O'Malley, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Bullitt, Jose A., Charles Davis, Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Guy Quinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, I hope everyone's having a good and safe holiday. As I said at the end of the interview there's a Patreon segment with Dr. Jack Hunter. Go to the website to become a patron, www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.